And yet God's dominion is over all things, and God's kingdom is going to be established, and God's kingdom is going to endure forever. But there's also a kind of a breaking point here, that chapter 7 is not really the conclusion of a section. Chapter 7 is more the beginning of a section. And I ask you to go even to verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions. What's significant about that? The first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. Who was the world ruler in chapter 6? Cyrus. So we are no longer following the historical narrative. Thus far, chapters 1 through 6 would seem to kind of follow along with each other in terms of history. You start with Daniel being taken captive, and then in chapter 6, Darius the Mede is ruling, and Daniel's thrown into the lion's den. But now we're going back in time. And in fact, all these visions happen in various points in Daniel's time in captivity. And this vision occurred about the year 553, somewhere around that time. But the Babylonians are still the dominant world empire. So chapters 1 through 6, again, is kind of more your historical narrative. Chapter 7, going through the end of the book, you have various signs, various revelations given to Daniel, and those occur at different times, but we're going to be looking at the importance of those things. That said, there are certainly some striking similarities between chapters 2 and chapter 7. Again, you have 4 world kingdoms that are described. You have God giving dominion to these kingdoms. You have a focus particularly on the 4th kingdom. In Daniel 2, that 4th kingdom is the legs of iron and iron mixed with clay, and that kingdom kind of trampling and crushing other kingdoms. In chapter 4, you're going to have this 4th beast that does the same, and more elaborate detail is given on this 4th beast in chapter 7. And then, of course, you have God establishing His eternal kingdom, which happens in both chapters. But there are also some points of contrast. Who receives the vision in chapter 2? Nebuchadnezzar. Chapter 7 is Daniel. This is a vision that Daniel receives. We see again further details about this 4th kingdom in chapter 7 that were not given in chapter 2. So this 4th kingdom, and a particular king in this 4th kingdom, uttering boasts and blasphemies against God, persecuting the saints, that's all going to be found here in chapter 7. And then we also are going to see that the saints, wow, I don't think that's a biblical term. The saints, they share in God's glory. They share in His rule and His victory that is established over this 4th kingdom. And then you also even have an indication about the length of time in which this 4th kingdom is going to have dominion. So again, there are certainly many parallels between the 2 chapters, but chapter 7 is going to go into some details that are just not found in chapter 2. The one other thing that I'll take note of is this is a But there's going to be great crisis with God's people. And it's going to be looking like God's people are losing. But God's going to come to their rescue. God is going to reset things on the earth. God is going to bring great judgments. And so this apocalyptic language is used in times of crisis and times of distress, but it always shows that God and His people are victorious. Daniel 7 is an example of that. Other passages in the Old Testament are examples of that, in Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Zechariah. And of course, what significant book in the New Testament kind of follows along that same pattern? Revelation. Okay, so you see the same thing, and at the end of the class tonight, we're going to look quite specifically at some ties between Daniel 7 and the book of Revelation. All right, any questions or comments before we get into the text itself? Okay, I've clearly explained everything that needs to be explained thus far. All right, we're just breaking the text into three big sections here. And even though it may just be one vision, we're going to look at the first part of the vision, which describes these four beasts. So it starts with Daniel receives this vision, and I do find it interesting, Daniel's reaction to this. I was looking, verse 2, in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. Four great beasts were coming up from the sea, different from one another, and he goes on to describe what these beasts are. I do want to urge us to understand apocalyptic language is symbolic. It's not allegory. You don't have to necessarily read something into every single aspect of the vision. That said, there are some common traits. So when you read about the four winds of heaven, you may just have God talking about the entire earth. The idea of the great sea in other passages is used to describe the nations of the earth. And that would seem to be something that would fit here. Because you have these four beasts, and where are these four beasts coming from? They come from the sea. And so if the sea is representative of the nations, then these are kingdoms that come from the nations of the world. Now it's also interesting in verse 23, they're said to come from the earth. So the point being, these are kingdoms that come from men. They come from the nations, they're of this world. That's important. He goes on to say that every one of these beasts differs from each other. And they do. But don't miss out on the fact that they all come from the same place. They're all kingdoms of this earth. They all come from the sea. They all come from the earth. Much like in chapter 2, we kind of get fixated on the different parts of the image. You've got a head of gold, and you've got the chest of silver, and midsection of bronze, and then legs of iron. But it's still all one image, and that image is shaped like a man. So you've got four kingdoms in chapter 2 that differ from each other, yet they're all part of one image, and that image, again, is an image of a man. Here, four beasts, they differ from each other, but they all come from the same place. They come from this world. So he goes on to describe these things. The first, he says, is like a lion and has the wings of an eagle. I do believe that you're tracking with the same kingdoms from chapter 2, so this would be representative of Babylon. And you get into the archaeology, and it makes a lot of sense because on the gates, the Ishtar gates, you would have these images even of lions with eagle's wings on them. And both terms are used in Scripture to describe Babylon. And then even in the latter part of verse 4, where he says, it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a human mind was also given to it. Well, what does that make you think of? You've read about it in Daniel, or something similar to it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So in chapter 4, you have Nebuchadnezzar, a man made to be like a beast. And then at the end, he becomes like a man again. And it may be that in this image, it's kind of reversing it. You have the beast becoming a man, but I think that's put there to help us to understand, here's what we're talking about. We're talking about this kingdom that Daniel had experience with, that we've already seen some things about in this book. He goes on to describe in verse 5, the second beast, resembling a bear, and it was raised up on one side, 3 ribs were in its mouth, and it was said to go and to devour much meat. Again, you can get into a lot of things here that I think are more along the lines of allegory. So, for instance, one guy I was reading was talking about, a bear has a really large territory. And Persia had a really large territory. I don't know that we're supposed to get that meaning out of the verse here. Even the idea of it's raised up on one side, so you have the dominant Persian side of the empire as a contrast to the Mede. Again, I don't know that we're supposed to get that. What we are told is that this kingdom devours. And guess what? That tracks along with Persia too. The Medo-Persian Empire devoured more kingdoms and consumed more territory than any empire before it. It was massive. Third kingdom, verse 6, like a leopard. It has on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Well, what do you associate with a leopard? Velocity, speed. If this is representative of the Grecian Empire, well, no one conquered territory faster than Alexander. And then we'll see in chapter 8 what happened after Alexander conquered his empire. Alexander dies, and what happens to that empire? Split up into 4 kingdoms. And so perhaps, again, you see that reference in the image here. Here's a leopard, 4 wings, 4 heads, speed, 4 parts. You can kind of put 2 and 2 together there. But much more is said about the final kingdom. After this, I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrifying and extremely strong, and it had large iron teeth. Again, that 4th part of the image in chapter 2 is made of iron. And just like the image in chapter 2, that last part crushed and trampled. So this beast devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet. And it was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. And when I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one, came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were pulled up by the roots before it, and behold, this horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boasts. So again, we're told more information now about this 4th kingdom. There is going to be boasting against God from this kingdom. And not only is this kingdom trampled, but we're going to see a little bit later on, this kingdom is persecuting the saints. Now again, here's where we kind of have to decide what's symbolic and where are we just trying to fit things in that maybe we're not necessarily supposed to. So I don't know if we're supposed to say, okay, this little horn that rises up, that's the 11th king, and we go back to our Roman history books and we count up to the 11th emperor. Maybe we are supposed to do that. And it would track with some things that would maybe be helpful to us. Or it may just be saying, you know what? This kingdom has great power, because that's what horns represent. And there's going to be parts of that kingdom, horns, that utilize that power in different ways. And utilize that power in boasting against God and persecuting His saints. And maybe we're not supposed to try to make, okay, here is the definitive point in time where that came to pass. I'll leave that up to you, which track you want to take, if you want to make that very specific, or if you want to go a little more general with it. I will just caution again, don't make the assumption that everything has to be fitting in and just, a direct comparison to something in history. All right. Any questions on the four beasts thus far? We're going to come back to them, but so far we're just kind of seeing what they are in the vision. Yeah.
Did you say the four winds that were stirring up the Great Sea, that was all a representative of the earth, or was that in verse 2?
Four winds in some passages can be representative of the entire earth. It can be representative of God and holding back even the winds of the earth. So I kind of get the picture, though. It's just like the earth in total. Kind of, yeah. All right. Let's continue on with the vision. So I kept looking until thrones were set up, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His vesture was like white snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool, and his throne was ablaze with flames. Its wheels were a burning fire. Here we have God in the picture now. Just based on that language, what would you say we're supposed to take away about God just on that verse?
He was there before the beast. Yeah. He was there before the kingdom, before the interpretation. I'm not sure what Daniel's seeing this, but the vision I have is coming from heaven, not coming from the earth. So it's almost more of a supreme being that's being introduced, and Daniel should have some sort of satisfaction that this is Jehovah, this is God.
Yeah, so there's a timelessness to this being. The four beasts, apparently, according to the vision, there's a time when they weren't. They're coming up out of the sea. They're making an appearance on the scene. But here's the one who's described as the Ancient of Days. So there's a timelessness to him, and as you said, a time where he existed before these beasts existed. And of course, I think we're to be impressed upon the fact that he is going to exist after they no longer exist. Okay, so you have the timelessness of Jehovah. What else? Okay, so there are, and it's not just one throne though, is it? There are thrones that are set up. He's ruling, he's sitting on his throne, but then there are others who are ruling with him, which I think is significant as we get later on in the vision. What else? Why does it describe his hair like wool? And his skin, his vesture like white snow, I should say, rather. Yeah, sanctity, holiness, absolute purity, what all belongs to him. And then it also makes a big point to say that there's flames and fire all around him. What are we to take from that? Judgment. And that's going to be borne out here in just a second. So it even says in verse 10, a river of fire was flowing and coming out from before him, and thousands of thousands were attending upon him, and myriads upon myriads were standing before him. The court sat, and the books were opened. What are these books? Books of life, books of judgment. And by the way, not the first time in Scripture that this idea is found. All the way back in Exodus 32 and verse 32, whereas Moses is pleading and petitioning with God, says, now if you will forgive their sin, and if not, please blot me out from your book which you have written. So there's this idea of God being aware, and God, I don't know if you want to say keeping track of, but God knowing who belongs to him, God being aware of the deeds of man, the deeds of the world, and so these books are open before him. Now, in very quick order then, just says in verse 11, I kept looking because of the sound of the boastful words which the horn was speaking, and I kept looking until the beast was slain, and its body was destroyed and given to the burning fire. Again, fire all around the throne of the Ancient of Days. Well, now this fourth kingdom that is boasting against Jehovah God, it is now consumed in those very flames. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but an extension of life was granted to them for an appointed period of time. I'll come back to this at the very end. I think my understanding of this is God has judged a kingdom, but there are other kingdoms that exist after that kingdom, right? There haven't ceased to be kingdoms of this world, and guess what? The kingdoms of this world continue to have some of the same traits and qualities as these kingdoms that we're reading about here. Persia is no longer on the scene. The Grecian Empire is no longer on the scene. The Roman Empire is no longer on the scene. But an extension of their life is still seen in the kingdoms around us. Again, I'll come back to that. But perhaps most significantly for us is what we read about in verses 13 and 14. I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man coming, and he came up to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom. Why is, and I certainly think we are looking at the Messiah here. We know Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man more than any other self-designation. About 80 times in the gospel where Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man. Just think about Daniel 7. Why is this one who comes before the Ancient of Days, why is he referred to as a Son of Man? Not a beast. That's it. The kingdoms of this world, they're beasts. But the one who's coming before the Ancient of Days is created in his image. One like a son of man. And likewise, what's he riding? Or what's he sitting on? Clouds of heaven. Well, where did these beasts originate? Earth. They came up from the sea. They came up from the earth. They're of this world. Is the Son of Man of this world? No, he comes before the Ancient of Days on the clouds of heaven. So he's not a part of this world. And he receives the everlasting kingdom. He is given dominion over all things. So in chapter 2 and verse 44, we saw how, in the days of those final kings, that image is shattered, and the rock cut out without hands is what does it. And that rock grows into become a mountain. And this is the kingdom of God, which is forever. Well, now we're added details. This happens when one in God's image comes before God. One who's not of this world comes before God. And then he is given complete dominion and control over all things. His kingdom is established, and his kingdom endures forever and ever. That's a whole lot in a very short span of time. So I will pause again for questions, comments. JD?
In verse 12, as for the rest of the beasts, I had obviously researched this probably a bit more than I have, but I was thinking that was the other kingdoms, like the previous beasts. Were you saying that those were beasts or kingdoms after the foreign beasts, or the original beasts that were there and just their dominion taken away?
So what shaped my thinking more on this than anything is Revelation 20, and we'll come to that hopefully in just a little bit. But if our understanding of Revelation is correct, and we're looking at something that's going on in the times of John, as we're to believe in Revelation 1 verse 1, that these are things shortly to come to pass. And in the times of John, Rome is persecuting God's saints. And the whole point is Satan is using this world empire to do his bidding, to persecute against God. And it looks like he's being successful. Guess what? He's not. God is showing in Revelation he's not. He's going to be destroyed. The beast that he used is going to be destroyed. And then you have this idea of Satan's power being limited for 1,000 years, and then Gog and Magog come on the scene, and they too are going to afflict God's people. To me, I think that's what we're getting at here. There's this idea that, okay, this one beast is destroyed. There are still other beasts out there. There's still the life force, if you will, of these beasts, of these kingdoms of the world that's still out there. God's still in control, God's still sovereign, but these other things are going to be happening too. Just because this one beast is destroyed doesn't mean that the world is now in submission to God. They're not. There's still the beast out there. That's, again, kind of my take on it. I don't know if that makes any sense or not.
Well, I haven't read Revelation 21 and dissected like I'll do that tonight.
Well, I'm sure I'm probably, well, I'm not going to say I'm probably wrong, but anyway. Who wants to hear their teacher say he's probably wrong? It's not wise. That's where I'd go in that anyway, in my thinking. All right. I do want to make sure we get to Revelation, though, so let's continue on. So, verse 15, Daniel's distressed by this, and I think that's interesting. You know, we've seen Nebuchadnezzar distressed by visions. We've seen Belshazzar distressed by vision. Now Daniel, the prophet of God, he's distressed by this. He's seeing things he doesn't understand. And so he asks for help. You know, Daniel is the one who interpreted the dreams for Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel's the one who interpreted the handwriting for Belshazzar. Now he needs someone to help interpret the vision for him. And so there's this unknown, not really said who it is, but a part of this vision that he's able to ask, perhaps one of the watchers that's been described earlier in the book, and he's asking for some help in understanding this. So first you have kind of just the synopsis of what happened. This being tells Daniel, these great beasts, which are 4 in number, are 4 kings will arise from the earth, but the saints of the highest one will receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever for all ages to come. That's the point. That's the very brief thesis statement of what happened. You've got these 4 said to be kings here, said to be kingdoms in other places, so I think that's what we're to believe here, is that it's kingdoms, but the saints are going to rule. Doesn't look like that in part of the vision, but that's the key takeaway. The saints receive the kingdom and possess it forever. All right? So, Daniel hears this, but he's still troubled. What about this 4th beast? What about this 4th beast that's trampling and devouring? And you've got these 10 horns, and you've got 1 horn that supplants 3 others, and it's boasting against God. And there's some other interesting things that are said about it. It says in verse 21 that horn was waging war with the saints and overpowering them. In verse 23, the 4th beast will be a 4th kingdom on the earth, which will be different from all the other kingdoms, and will devour the whole earth and tread it down and crush it. And as for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings will arise, and another will arise after them, and he will be different from the previous ones, and will subdue 3 kings. And he will speak out against the Most High, and wear down the saints of the highest one. And he will intend to make alterations in times and in law, and they'll be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. That phrase where he intends to make alterations in time may itself be significant, because go back to chapter 2. Chapter 2 and verse 21, when Daniel is going to, actually in this case, he is praising God for having revealed to him the mystery of King Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. And he says this about God: it is He who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men. He and knowledge to men of understanding. So Daniel says in chapter 2 and verse 21, Jehovah changes the times and the epochs. What is this horn taking upon himself? I'll make alterations in the times. I'll abrogate to myself the power and authority of God. Okay? So, you have all these things that are said about this fourth beast. Waging war against the saints, doing so for a time, times, and half a time. Declaring the right to do what only God can do. But the court will sit for judgment, and his dominion will be taken away. Because don't forget, God's the one that gave dominion in the first place. That said in verse 6 earlier in the chapter, that third kingdom, it received dominion. God gives a dominion. Well, that dominion is going to be taken away. Then the sovereignty, the dominion, and the greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people, the saints of the highest one. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all the dominions will serve and obey him. We're running out of time, so I want to go ahead and go to this. Daniel 7 is found frequently in Revelation. There are quite a few parallels. Beasts coming up from the sea. There are components. So whereas in Daniel 7 you have a lion and a bear and a leopard, individual kingdoms, the beast that comes out of the sea in Revelation has aspects of all those things. So it's kind of like this amalgamation of all the kingdoms is coming up, kind of representative of that. You got the idea of 10 horns. You've got boasting against God, blaspheming God, beast rising from the earth, the fourth beast waging war with the saints, beasts overpowering the saints, oppressing the saints for time, times, and half a time. And again, in symbolic language, kind of the idea of not a complete period of time, a broken period of time, and yet it's still an oppression nonetheless. Books are opened, judgment is declared, the beast utterly being destroyed is found in Revelation. There, in point number 11 is what I was talking about earlier, JD. I think you had the idea of the life of the beast being extended with Gog and Magog, Satan using those to war against the saints. Again, I may be making a stretch there. But then, of course, you also have the picture of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven in Revelation 2. So all that to say this. I firmly believe Revelation is written to a people in crisis. It was written at a point in time where God's people were in crisis. They were being persecuted. It looked like the beast, it looked like Satan was winning. And Revelation was written to say, Satan is not winning. Jehovah reigns, and his saints are going to reign with him. And this is all exactly what Daniel was pointing to. Daniel is in the very beginning of this period of time where these kingdoms have arisen. Again, in the reign of Belshazzar, that's that first beast, Babylon. But Daniel's able to see all the way down to when this fourth beast comes and what that fourth beast is going to be doing against the saints of the Most High. And Daniel's being given a message to say, I'm going to be victorious then too. Just as God had been ruling in the time of Babylon and Persia, and Daniel was able to see that, now Daniel is being communicated a message. There's going to come a time much later where it looks like I'm losing. I'm still ruling. I'm still reigning. My saints are going to reign. My kingdom is going to be established, and it is going to dwell forever. So I think that's what we have here in Daniel chapter 7. Now again, as I mentioned, when you look at those horns, if you want to make specific application, you can read plenty about, well, you know, if you look in your emperors, you come to Domitian, and Domitian being the emperor who is persecuting during the time of John and Revelation being written, and that may be an exact parallel there. I still don't know if we're supposed to say, okay, this is a specific ruler or just a general character. Mike? Or Michael, sorry.
and I think you make the point so well. I want to add one piece to that, and maybe you did and I didn't catch it, but this is also so that whenever the people in the time of Revelation looked at what was being written, they could go back in their mind's eye to the time of Daniel and say, this is what God said all along. This isn't an accident. He said it before so that when it came to pass, we would understand that there was a prophet in our midst. And I don't want to jump ahead, but I'm going to jump a little bit ahead. In the last verse of Daniel, he said, but as for you, go your way to the end, then you will enter your rest and rise again for your allotted portion at the end of the age. Mm-hmm. He said, Daniel, don't worry about it. You're going to pass away. One day you're going to rise when that time comes, and you're going to have all of the answers that you need. Yeah. And I think those two things kind of ought to give us comfort. To know that God knew about it ahead of time. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't something. And if we do the same thing as Daniel, we'll see the culmination of that.
Just to summarize for those who are viewing from home, Brother Michael's point was, the first point anyway, this is so that those in the time of Revelation can understand God said this was going to happen all along. You know, it's not just that John is writing something for us and giving a message from Jesus. No, he's conveying something that he had earlier conveyed to Daniel. And so this gives us peace, this gives us comfort, knowing that this has always been what God had declared would happen. So again, just to emphasize, we've been trying to do throughout this class, Daniel's about God being sovereign, God ruling over the realm of mankind. God ruled over the realm of mankind in the days of Daniel, and God's point now is, I'm still going to be ruling over mankind well into the future, in days that you can only imagine. Now, we'll say one final thing, because we're going to continue looking at various images and visions. I do believe Daniel 7 is looking forward to the Roman Empire. Don't think that every vision is about the Roman Empire, because they're not. There's going to be visions about Greece. There's going to be, in the next chapter, we're going to read about Persia and Greece. So not everything in Daniel is about one empire, one kingdom, but rather God in all these things talking about how His rule, His reign is established regardless of what empire was ruling at the time. You've been very kind. I hope what I said made sense. If you have any questions about it, please let me know, and I'll do my best to answer those. Lord willing, we'll take chapter 8 next Wednesday.